Last lecture, we talked about the exterior of the Cantor Center on Stanford's campus and how it relates to the classical world. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go inside. First thing I want you to notice is that the floor plan, it's laid out symmetrically, which is a convention that's held over from architecture from the classical Greek world, like the Parthenon. It's also a holdover from the actually 19th century academic tradition of looking back at classicism as well. So you're going to see actually the influence of classicism as it sort of funneled through history to the 19th century. And if you take some more in-depth art history courses, you'll kind of understand that. So because it's symmetrical and it's laid out in such a way that it's sort of a predictable layout of the building, there are some things that you will expect to see when you walk in. And so in the main lobby, the first thing that you notice when you walk into the building is a Roman triumphal arch. Now, triumphal arches are something that have been around since antiquity, but basically since ancient Rome. And you can look up arches like the Arch of Titus or the Arch of Constantine, or even in France, the Arc de Triomphe, which are basically using a Roman technological innovation to create a monument or a trophy or a gateway that comes in and out of a town. And it became a tradition to incorporate arches into artwork, for instance, like the Colosseum, as a way to talk about the superiority of Roman technology, especially when it came to building Roman arches. And they also did some things with concrete and cement that we're very indebted to them for. This triumphal arch that we're looking at is a sort of 19th century version of a triumphal arch from ancient Rome. So things like those doubled columns on either side, that would have never been done. Also, the way that the entablature on the top sort of jogs in and out above the triglyphs and the metapiece would have been also something that in the ancient world would have never happened. But something that is very possible is at the top of an arch you would have a statue that represents a sort of ideal. And in this instance, what we're looking at is a statue of either Minerva or Hera or Athena. She's basically the goddess of wisdom. And I like to think of her as Athena. And she is looking at you as you walk into this sort of temple of wisdom and learning. And I think that's a big part of the idea. Now, some other little elements that we've been kind of looking at are architectural elements. And up here, what you see is almost a mishmash of architectural styles that go all the way back to ancient Greece, but go through Rome and then go through the Roman era of the Italian Renaissance and the Baroque, and then into the 19th century academic style. And what I'm specifically talking about is that they would have never combined or reconfigured all of these different kinds of ornaments together before the 19th century, really. Maybe in the Mannerist period, which is around 1500 in the Renaissance, they started doing things like this. So if you know a lot about those components in those units and you study architecture a little bit more in depth, you'll be able to appreciate some of the weird things that they're doing that would be, for an art historian, kind of an interesting idea. So if you continue to look up and you walk around this statue, you'll see that she resembles an awful lot a statue that you've encountered in one of the earlier videos, which is the statue of Athena that was located inside the main cella of the Parthenon. And what I'm specifically talking about here is the statue that was almost 2 stories tall that was in the interior, and she was standing in contrapposto, and she had a ship's mast for her for the interior core. Her skin was ivory, and they really celebrated this thing. And there's kind of fun stories about, for instance, Phidias the sculptor put his face on the put a likeness of, I think, Pericles or himself on the shield, and he was thrown into jail for impiety, that kind of thing. But the main reason for comparing these two is to actually talk about the idea that the goddess of wisdom is in the heart, greeting you in the main lobby. Off on the left-hand side on the lower level, that actually goes 2 stories tall. It's where the Rodins are kept now. But in the interior of this room is a dome. And we're going to look at the various domes around the Cantor Center And the first one we're going to look up at is the one in the center of the main lobby when you walk in, above Athena's head. On the surrounding shapes of it, you see coffers, and those are squares within squares that we're going to see in a building called the Pantheon. The dome itself is not a circle, it's more like a sort of capsule or an oval, which is also a sort of 19th century take on things. In the classical world, especially in ancient Rome, they would have been completely circular domes. So there are references to Roman architecture and references to Roman classicism here, but they're brought through later periods, for instance, the Mannerist period or the Baroque period during the Italian Renaissance. They sort of changed circles for ovals and things like that. So the next dome that we're going to look at is in that Rodin octagon. And it relates in some ways to a building called the Pantheon in Rome. So in order to understand the use of coffers and domes and circles and things like that, you need to study the Pantheon a little bit more in depth. So I want to give you a list of main ideas that you will apply to, for instance, studying the interior dome of the Rodin section of the Cantor Center, but they're also really important historical ideas for understanding architecture, and then we'll go into more detail about it. So starting with the exterior of the building looks like the Parthenon, but when you walk in, it's this big circle, and it's a completely circular room. Probably there's iconography involved with circles being continuous forms and being a sort of globe, that kind of thing. And in fact, some Greeks and Romans had actually thought the world was round and was a sphere. You've been taught different, I know. Okay. The other thing is the uses of arches and other kinds of technologies like cement and concrete were very instrumental in the creation of this building. So they were able to make a building using cement, which they figured out how to make it slower drying, and use what's called a Roman Triumphal Arch and rotate it 360 degrees, in which you then have a keystone in the oculus, which is that skylight in the top is called an oculus for the eye, and it locks up and it uses this sort of tensile strength of the structure leaning in on itself, along with variations in concrete to make it hold up together. The other way that they do this is with the coffers. Then the last thing is the interior is a mishmash of architectural styles from the ancient Greek world, okay? And so they built everything out of cement and brick and arches, but they facaded it or faced everything with different kinds of colored marbles. So let's go into some more detail and look at that stuff.
The last classic building that we're going to talk about from the Roman classic era before we get into the Christian Roman period and the Byzantine periods is the Roman Pantheon. And if you look at the Roman Pantheon, the first thing that you need to know is that there was a building originally there that was built for Marcus Agrippa. And so when Hadrian, who was probably the patron for this building and even possibly the architect, built it, what he suggested or made them do was inscribe Agrippa basically built this originally, or this is dedicated to Agrippa. And so Marcus Agrippa is the first builder, and then it was torn down, and then the Emperor Hadrian comes along and constructs this building. So this building is really quite an architectural marvel in a lot of ways, and the way that we're seeing it in this photo is not really accurate. It's actually, there would have been walls around it. So let's take a look at some diagrams. Initially, the building would have been placed in a courtyard, and you would have walked up to it and seen basically just this portico that looks an awful lot like the Parthenon as you're walking towards it. So when you entered the building, you would have been surprised and shocked, I guess, in a way, to see this dome structure on the interior. And so in some ways, the basic ideology or the basic plan of Roman architecture is that it tends to be much more shocking, much more dramatic, much more engaging and interactive in some ways than the Parthenon or the classic Athenian age. So again, we're building on that. The other way that it builds on some of the ideas from for instance, the Parthenon, is that it is a building that's called the Pantheon. Theos is, or theon means religion or gods, and pan means all. So like the Pan-Athenaic procession, contains all the gods. And it's my understanding that actually you could go inside and there were altars to individual gods around the interior drum of it. So it would have been really more inclusive, and it wouldn't have been exclusive the way the Parthenon, where you couldn't even go inside and you'd have to stand outside and worship Athena from afar. In this instance, it's round and it's inclusive. Now, the other thing is that in terms of the overall symbology or iconography of the building, what you could probably say is that that circular form is also a sort of all-encompassing form, and it's continuous, almost like the dome of heaven. And the other thing that I think that it relates to is that I know that you're probably taught that they didn't think that the world was a sphere or round, and that the planet was flat. That's not necessarily true. There were actually people in ancient Greece and also in ancient Rome who believed that the planet was a globe and that it was sort of a universal form. And they had even computed the actual circumference of the globe as well. So that would tie in a little bit with the structure, because if you look at the cutaways, and you can tell that it really is a form that's built mainly on a circular kind of form. Now, the other thing that I think is kind of important is the uses of the different technologies that we just discovered, or not just discovered, that they had discovered at that time. For instance, there was an extensive use of cement and concrete to build the dome, and there was also that arch technology. So if you were to take an arch and rotate it 360 degrees, basically make it a circle, the keystone at the top that we had studied before would become the oculus in the top of that. And the oculus is just basically a hole in the roof with a ring of stones around it that lock it into place. And the circulation of that arch creates a dome-like structure. Now, the dome that is created by the concrete and the cement the cement is slowed down, it was actually poured in to make what's called coffers in the ceiling. And one of the best ways to take a look at this is actually to look at a painting by this guy named Giovanni Panini from the 1600s. So this painting shows you actually the dome on the ceiling, and shows you how the coffers were poured cement. And that hole in the ceiling would have been used to allow smoke to come out. And the interior structure itself was this structure that was polychromed, because it was basically brick and cement, and then other kinds of stone were placed on top, different colors of stone. And the actual, for instance, the columns and things like that aren't really there to support it. That dome is supported mainly by a drum that runs around the exterior of it, and also by the cement and concrete and brick that's used to build it. So we kind of need to go back and take a look at the overarching form of it again, and some plans of it. So if you look at the plans and you compare it to the actual building, one of the things that you'll also see is that the coffered ceiling, the way that those things are scooped out, probably was a way of relieving some of the weight as it moved up, and it also provided an optical illusion that would move your eye up to the top. And if you look at the coffers in any depth, and we will in a second, they also pull your eye out, almost like perspective, although they didn't have linear perspective at that time. The drum has a series of barrel vaults that run around the interior of it inside. And this dome is also stepped up, and the cement gets thinner and thinner as you get near the top, near the oculus on the very top of it. Now, they also changed the composition of the cement, and what I should mention is one of the things that the Romans did is that they figured out certain kinds of sands, like sand from Pazzuli, would actually, that's a volcanic sand, would slow the drying process down so that they could work the cement and mold coffers and things like that a little bit more, with a little bit more leisure. The other thing that they also figured out is that they could change the composition of the cement by adding volcanic rock, which is very porous. If you've ever picked up a volcanic rock, it looks really heavy, but it's super light. So they mixed that in as the gravel as they got near the top. Otherwise, this thing would be very top heavy and could cave in almost like a souffle. And so they figured out how to do that. And one of the other details that I think is really cool is that if you zoom in on the side of the drum from the exterior, you can actually see there's a series of arches built around the drum inside the brickwork of it that provides even more support in the structure. So they actually incorporated a series of arches to redistribute force and send it down into the side walls. Now, some of the other interesting little details about it is that you can see that the decoration on it is a sort of combination of decorations that we've seen from the classical world, kind of pseudo Corinthian columns and Tuscan order, and the entablature is a little bit riffing on some of the Ionic and Corinthian types and Tuscan styles. The interior of the building is really an exercise in drama. When you walk in, you're confronted by all this different colored kinds of light bouncing off of all of these different kinds of surfaces. And so you have this almost Baroque way of combining different colors and different architectural orders on the interior. For instance, all these like sort of little huts or altars that run around the bottom of it have slightly different architectural orders, and those are supposed to be exterior architectural orders. They're almost like a temple within a temple within a temple. The oculus at the top that we had looked at before really is a way of relieving some of the stress, allowing natural light to come in and smoke to come out. But students always ask me, so rain gets in, right? And birds and stuff. Yeah, well, rain does. And so what they did with the floor is there's actually a slope to the floor and a series of drains that run underneath it. And since the floor is basically made out of stone, the surfaces would not have been hurt or damaged in any way. Interesting also little details about this building, sort of contextual details, is that when Christianity came to power, and finally when the Catholics were in full force, especially during the 1600s in the contemporary era, one of the things that they did was they converted this into a church. It was basically a Catholic church. So when Raphael was around in the 1500s and he died, he asked to be buried there, and he is. So right now it's actually a church. And one of the other things that for instance, Gian Lorenzo Bernini needed in the 1650s, he needed bronze enough to do a construction project inside St. Peter's, the Catholic cathedral. And what the Pope gave him permission to do was take the doors off of the Pantheon that had been there for centuries and melt them down. So there's a joke that sometimes the tour guides say that whatever the barbarians didn't destroy, the Barberini did. So this building was the largest dome in the world at that point in time, and was also probably, I think, the largest building of the time, and combines all of the technologies: cement, concrete, domes, arches, different compositions of cement, and then also uses lesser materials for the construction of it, and facades or veneers the interior to make it look like a really fancy temple, and in a way was more permanent because it wasn't painted surfaces like you would see on the Parthenon or the Areopagus Augustae.